I'm Susan Smith, and welcome to my studio Stitched by Susan. Today's project is going to be this double wedding ring that we are rescuing and making into a quilt that can be loved and used. So one more sip of coffee and we're going to get started. Alrighty, you can see my long arm. Her name is Lucy, sitting beside me. Lucy is a Gamble, 26-inch throat. So that's the machine I'll be working on. Today's project is freehand, which means there's no digital driving on the computer and no pantograph. It's entirely freehand, and also is edge to edge, meaning the same quilting design is laid across the whole quilt. We're not doing specific things in different areas. So that's how I define edge to edge or all over quilting. That's what we'll be doing today. And I'm focusing on not so much the quilting design as talking to you about the ways that I'm managing this quilt top. So can we maybe have a different view, Dave, that will show the quilt top? I don't know which camera is best for this. Hang on a sec while we change. Okay, that one works well. The machine is in there. So let me move Lucy out of the way a little bit. And we'll do a little bit big picture of what we're working with today. So first off, I did misspeak yesterday. Someone asked if this was hand-pieced or machine-pieced, and I said machine, and that is actually incorrect. I got looking at the back properly, and it is both. So that's how come I made the mistake easily. The seam I checked before obviously was machine-stitched, but there is both on here, and I would actually say more hand-stitching than machine. It dates, I'm thinking, to the 40s or even 30s, judging by the prints. And what has happened is each of these melons, are a certain size, but all the white areas were eased in. So every white area, the four-sided blocks and the little melon shapes bubble. There's excess fabric in every one of them. Can you see that? So that's the major challenge that we're dealing with in this quilt, is trying to pull all that excess in and corral it. And that's kind of why I chose an edge-to-edge design, because I felt it would be way too difficult to, be stitching around the perimeter of this and try to be doing a specific design in a specific area and manage all that excess. Probably wasn't going to work out well. So doing an edge-to-edge one gives me a lot more room to manipulate and maneuver. A couple other things too. Doing a curvy edge-to-edge design is what really pulls in that excess and controls it. So I definitely would not have tried anything on this quilt that involved straight lines or ruler work. You can see if you just tried to stitch straight across that, you'd end up with puckers and pleats. So the all-over feather that I'm quilting on it is not only curvy, like everything in it is round, but they're small little elements. It's not big sweeping curves either. So that combined, the curvy quality and the smallness, every one of those feathers almost creates a little button, eating up that little bit of fabric and pulling it into that small curvy feather. So that's the number one technique that I'm applying to control this fuzziness. A couple other thoughts were in my head as I was thinking about this quilt. One of them certainly was, I'm going to have to be satisfied with some level of imperfection. So on a couple of ways. There is going to be a little bit of puckering. I'm trying not to get any pleats. I think I've only actually gotten 2 little pleats so far, but there is a certain amount of fullness between the feathers or within the feather that doesn't lay perfectly smoothly. I've accepted that. That's as good as I can make it, and that will kind of disappear as it's used and washed and just will become puffiness. Also, I've accepted that there's no easy way to make it perfectly square. And it's easy to camouflage that because I have the round scalloped edges. And so I'm pretty much eyeballing this process. From side to side, I'm just making my melons be smooth and flat. And then I'm fitting in the cream colored bits between. And I'm not really worried about whether this row of melons is a 1/2 inch wider than that row or not. I'm just eyeballing it. Also, when I'm looking at it this way to try and get them straight, every time I advance, I'm eyeballing any line of piecing. In this case, it was the melons as it comes across my rail. I'm just looking to see, are they advancing at about the same pace so that I don't get to the end of the quilt and have a couple inches left on one side, right? So with each pass, I'm kind of adjusting, tweaking, but it's not perfection, right? I'm just doing it by eye. So it's going to look good when it's done, but it probably won't be perfect. I'm good with that level of carefulness. So let's get started quilting. What I've done already yesterday, and I will do more of today so that you'll get a chance to see it, is basting the outer perimeter of the scalloped edges. So that fixes my quilt on both sides. Obviously the roll fixes it over here, and then the last thing I do is I put magnetic bars on the front rail to fix this in place. That means that when I do my quilting in here, it's not going to pull up, you know, and get unevenness. It's going to mean when my bars are here, all four sides are stabilized, they're staying in place, and now I can quilt freely in the open area and know that things are not shifting on me. So here come my bars. They're just simple hardware store variety magnetic bars, and they just clip right on the front and hold my quilt from being able to move. And by the way, this is the end of the quilt right here, so we definitely will finish it this morning. We're close, real close. Okay, so there's that. I like to alternate my directions of passes. So my last batch of feathers I quilted from left to right. So this time I'm going to start at the right and quilt back to the left. That just helps everything to look natural and organic, and you don't immediately see my thread path. That's not the first thing you see after the fact. Maybe one more thing I'll point out. Let me just get my needle in place. The primary thing I feel like of importance when you're trying to ease in all this fabric is that you distribute it. So I talked about a couple ways yesterday, and I'll use them today so you can see them at work again. So one of them is that you just kind of with your hands move that fabric around until it's evenly distributed. So for example, I don't want to have this part pulled down snug. That makes this white more flat, but leaves me with a bunch of excess right here. So I literally zhuzh the fabric a little bit till I think it's fairly evenly distributed. If I think there's quite a lot, and there is, of ripples, and it might be hard to manage, I will drop some pins in, kind of cutting this in half. Do you know what I mean? And that also gives me barriers. So when I'm moving around, those pins help me know by the time I get to that pin, I've got to have taken up this excess, right? So just dropping in a few pins helps to kind of manage it. And I do it this way and this way. Wherever I see that fullness that I think is going to be tricky to manage, I drop pins here and there. Yes, zhuzhing the fabric, a real technical term, but descriptive, am I right? Again, I don't want to be pushing my fabric down here toward my magnetic bars, because then I'm going to run into a problem when I advance this. There's going to be a whole bunch of bulk there. So important that I get it distributed, get it taken up as I quilt this pass. I think that's looking pretty good. Okay, let's pop those pins aside and get started quilting. So I've just taken, I'm in the basting space over here on the edge. I've just taken a few threads to, or a few tight stitches to anchor my threads, and I'll just get started quilting. One more thing before I get started quilting. I need to put my edge clamps on. And usually I use these long clamps that come with my red snapper system because I love having this length and having tension across that whole pass, that whole quilting area. But in this case, my fabric edge was torn, and so it's a bit fuzzy and hard to get in my little channels. So apparently I'm on this camera, but I can't move Lucy, Dave, so that doesn't work well. Well, I'll just keep talking. You guys will see this happen more often today, so you'll get a visual before we're all finished. The end result is that I'm just putting my single clamps on each side and clamping gently, because it takes a little time and fiddliness to get that rough edge into the clamp that I would usually use. So this is a reality show, so I'm just telling you exactly why or why not that I'm doing things. Difficult to get that clamp on, so I've chosen a shortcut. This is not my favorite way because, can you see them? Yes. The individual clamp just puts tension on that little tiny area, so that's why I prefer the long clamp, but needs must, right? So they're not pulling very hard. I've just put them on there very gently. And now we shall quilt. I'm going to get to an area where I think you can see it well, and I'll talk to you about how I'm manipulating this fabric a little bit. But on this print, it's hard to see. So bear with me a second. Okay, here I think you can see better. So the arm of Lucy is right under here, kind of the nose of that arm is right under here. So I'm using that as my tool to manipulate this fabric. So you will see my left hand moving all the time, and I'm basically easing fabric. So the same way that when you're sewing a seam, you can put tension on the one fabric and ease the other one into it. I'm basically easing on the long arm. I'm coaxing extra fabric to go under the needle that would not naturally go if I just sewed over it with my hopper foot. So that's why I call this remedial quilting. You're talking the quilt into doing something it might not want to do on its own. Now I am doing all of that with my left hand, but I do have a little trick for you. I showed it yesterday, but I'll show it again today. If you're not comfortable quilting one-handed, here's my little workaround. Bear with me a second while I grab it. Which camera are we on, Dave? This one. Okay. Here's my trusty vegetable cans. They are mixed veg, which I would never, frankly, eat out of a can. Nasty. But they're great quilting tools. And you can put one on either side of your long arm. It's kind of going to roll off because I'm close to the edge. But you get the idea. It's doing the same thing. It's kind of hyperextending that fabric over the long arm nose and taking the place of my left hand being free. And now, well, I can't put both cans on because one's going to roll away. But now I can quilt two-handed, and it's doing a bit of the work that my left hand would have done. Any small weight will do. Doesn't have to be a can. But the beauty of a can is if you orient it front to back, it will roll out of the way. As I quilt that direction, it will just roll in front of me, and then I don't have to let go and move it regularly. Make sense? So that's one of the little tools in my arsenal. I do recommend that whenever you can, you do practice quilting with one hand like this, because it really, when you're working on a quilt that's challenging like this, you'll find it super, super helpful to have your left hand free to manipulate. And I quilt slower this way for sure than I quilt two-handed, but that's okay, right? So just slow down as much as you need to. And I don't know that you can see on camera, but I changed my grip a little bit too. Are we able to see this? You really can't. There's handlebars on my machine, as there will be on yours, and I lower my right hand. This may just be me, but I lower my right hand way down when I'm doing this one-handed grasp. Somehow that control feels better. I don't know if it's the same way for you, but I do encourage you to experiment with holding the handlebars a little differently, because one way may work better than another. And it may be a little different on your machine too. Some machines have slanted handlebars, things like that. So experiment. See if there's a way that it feels, you just need to be in control of the machine. So see if there's a way that feels better. And so we just begin stitching, manipulating that fabric every time we see fullness coming up. And I'm going slow enough too that I can always be looking ahead or glancing ahead of where I'm quilting to see what's coming, to see what challenging fullness is up ahead and how much I need to make adjustments. So that's really important too. It's almost like when you're driving and you don't want to look right at the nose of your vehicle, but you kind of want to look out ahead where you're heading. It helps you drive more smoothly. It also helps you quilt more smoothly, and it helps you, in this case, not to get blindsided by wrinkles that are coming, because you're always looking ahead and being aware of where they are. There was silence there for a few seconds. Dave did a quick change of batteries in my mic. That's one way to make Susan be quiet, is let her batteries run out. Just saying. So can you see as I'm working in this white, I am literally coaxing excess fabric to fall within that feather plume. And it's probably hard to see on camera, but from the angle that I'm looking at, that almost every plume looks like a little button. Like there's so much extra fabric in there, and that's good. That's what we want. So instead of a pleat, we're just taking it up a bit at a time, almost a stitch at a time. We're coaxing that fabric to be inside our feather plumes. And slowing down is really your friend. You can see I have a whole bunch here. And if I go slow enough, each stitch takes up a little bit of excess and I can get across it without any actual pleats forming. I think. Wow. I don't think there are actually any pleats there. There is certainly, what's the word I want? Creases. You can see it being pulled, you know, the angle. But I think when the quilt is released off the long arm and used a little bit, those are just going to look like fullness and not pleats. I call that a win. So that is my system in a nutshell. Taking out the pins that are in front of me. And it's fairly remarkable, I feel like, how much actual excess can be taken up. These older fabrics are often a looser weave, like less threads per inch than modern cottons, and that kind of works in my favor too. It makes it a little bit more malleable. And that's exactly what I want. Can you see this little knob? It's just about underneath. Let me do one more. Well, I'll stitch it and then I'll tell you about it. I've made the point many times that what catches the eye when the quilting is finished, what catches the eye is the areas that are raised. So either large areas that are unquilted, or in this case, I was dealing with a really bubbly seam allowance that didn't lay flat at all. My answer to that is stitch it down. So my initial feather kind of went around it, accentuating it. That's not what I want. So throughout the quilt, I've done these little feathers that have a secondary spine / mini feather inside them. Practically speaking, that's what's nailing down those bubbly areas for me. And aesthetically speaking, I'm doing it fairly frequently so that it looks like a design choice. It looks like part of my feather design on this quilt is adding these little echoey ones inside. So there's a tip for you. If you have to make a remedial type of stitch or type of design or something in an awkward corner, do it more frequently so it looks like part of your design choice on purpose. Here's one of my little pins, and can you see I'm really getting some excess down here, so I'm going to focus on pushing as much of that up as I can. I don't want to just push it down. That would keep my area here flat. Yes, it would, but it would really create a definite problem lower that I might have a hard time dealing with. So I'm going to push some of that up and just really coax it in to my feathers that I'm quilting right now, and hopefully alleviate the big problem 2 inches lower. We'll see in the next pass how successful I was. So I'm just going to keep quilting. While I do, I'll talk to you about a few of the other things that I offer. I'm very much a proponent of freehand and edge-to-edge quilting. I absolutely love to show how it can be beautiful. You do not have to do custom work for it to be gorgeous, and how it is particularly suited toward quilts that are what I call couch quilts, quilts that are going to be used. To that end, one of the things I do is these regular live and unscripted episodes, which are live streaming, like in real time, of a project that I'm quilting. And my goal with these is to just show you what that actually looks like, what types of decisions I face, what types of challenges like this quilt, and how I address them. And that is not to say that I know everything about quilting. By no means. I have learned from even you viewers on this show. But I'm just showing you sort of how it goes down in my studio and inviting you to look over my shoulder and see that. I feel like long arming can be quite solitary. You don't get to work with other people very often. And so I feel like this can be really helpful to see how someone else does it, to learn about their tools, to learn about their tips. So that's what this is all geared toward. In addition, I'm fairly active on social media, posting pictures of things that I do. On Instagram, I post reels, which are little tiny mini videos that are often tips or tutorials. So I invite you to follow along there. I try to keep them informative and helpful. And I am Stitched by Susan across all the platforms. So I'd love if you would like and subscribe to this channel. Like I said, these episodes are aired the first and third Friday of every month. And they are live with all the oopses, live with all the yay success moments. It's all there for you to see and enjoy. And also share with your fellow quilters if you know other quilters that you think would benefit. I'd love to have them along. That would be great. So again, I'm looking down. You're at a close hand view, but I'm looking about 8 inches toward me. I'm seeing my next pin and seeing there's quite a bit of fullness in here. So I'm again zhuzhing a little bit of that upwards and making a real effort to be including that as I go. It's so important that you, in so many ways, so many areas of quilting, that you manage as you go in small incremental steps. Whether it's, squaring the whole quilt on your long arm or whether it's managing fullness like this one, if you let it add up, that's when you really run into problems that seem insurmountable. But if I'm continually working toward managing that fullness, in every feather I'm trying to take up some of it, that over time, accumulating, manages all this fullness. It's quite astonishing how much is actually getting worked in. I can't help but think as I'm quilting over all these little prints of, what perhaps little dresses or little short sets or little aprons these fabric represented in someone's life. That to me is what makes it worth taking the time to breathe new life into a quilt like this. To finish it, to make it possible for someone to love it and use it. And even though this quilt definitely shows signs of hard wear over the years, it's got quite a few stains, things like that. Nevertheless, I think that it's so worth finishing and loving and preserving the time that someone did put into it to make it in the first place. We're just continuing that story and giving it a happy ending. Here again, I'm going to do a little echo inside that feather to just tuck that seam allowance down nice and firmly. And here we are at the edge and time to advance. So this is a great opportunity to type some questions into the chat window. I will undo all my various apparatuses. Apparatuses. I'm not sure. And start advancing the quilt, and then we'll have a look at the comments. So I'm going to unattach Lucy so that I can move her a little bit and show you a couple more things here. And why I'm doing this in a certain way. Come on, Lucy. So we've basically got one more set of rings to do. Now, the area that I've got quilted is way up at the top here. I'm not going to be able to quilt quite as close to that, but I went ahead and advanced because I'm going to go ahead and get this whole lower edge basted and stabilized. And then I'll just reverse the quilt a little bit, quilt one more pass, and then do this last bit. Does that make sense? So I often do that when I'm coming to the bottom edge of a quilt. You know, I could just baste a little bit, quilt, run, row, baste again, but those of you who were here yesterday know that I put my ruler plate on for basting so that I could use a curved ruler to help manage this edge. And so I choose to do it all in one fell swoop just to save time. So here's my trusty ruler plate, which I'm putting on. Moving my little veggie cans out of the way. Bear with me a second. So on my machine, the ruler plate just slides on and grips with a kind of rubberized spring. Different machines function a little bit differently, but the end result is the same. You create this little working surface that's a bit like a table so that you can put a ruler on it and it doesn't wobble. And you'll see in a moment how I'm going to use the ruler to help baste. I'm just reinserting my bobbin because when I put my ruler plate on, it always lays on the bobbin thread and catches it and makes it not want to pull up like I want it to. So that is all ready. Now I'm going to take a minute and pin the whole bottom area of this quilt so that I know where it's at and I don't get any surprises as I'm moving along. My little pin bowl is magnetic, so I can set it right on the rail and it won't go anywhere, which is helpful. So again, I'm kind of organizing this by eye because I know it's not perfect. And in fact, how would you know if it's perfect? Because they're all rounded edges, right? So I'm just eyeballing this to make sure these are all about the same length. This one is about the same width as the one that was above it. So it's not a precise science, but it's what I'm doing. And then I'm just going to kind of start in the middle and at each quarter get things pinned, and then I'll go back in and put many more pins in between. And that's basically it. So do we want to see some comments while I pin? Because this is going to take a couple of minutes to pin things.
This is your reminder from Karen.
Karen, did you remove your ruler base plate? Thanks for the reminder. I'll need it again in a minute or two here. And Karen again, super to see how loose your quilt is when the cans are on the fabric. I'm inclined to tighten too much. Yes, I feel like tightening should only be enough to keep things smooth. The tighter it is, the more that can mess with your tension, and that's not a good thing. Barbara, with the scrappy variety of this quilt, are you having tension problems across the top as the fabrics change? I'm not really, Karen. They're all pretty thin. There's nothing that's a different texture like a batik might be, so it seems to be working okay. Sue, when you first got your long arm, did you take any formal classes? No, I didn't. And even I purchased my machine used, so the lady I bought it from let me try it out a little bit in her home and gave me a few tips. perhaps maybe an hour's worth. That's how I started, and I just dove in. And I guess that's why I'm here today, is because I remember that overwhelming feeling every time I loaded a quilt of thinking, I don't know if I should bury my threads and knot them every time, or if it's okay to just take a few back stitches, or if it's okay to stitch over what I've done before. Yeah, all those questions. I remember all those questions. I'm Dave, Mr. Producer's trying to get me to move closer to the camera, but I'm supposed to be pinning while I talk. Laurel, how do you stay focused on the feather design versus the shapes of the quilt pieces and ensure it's distributed evenly? Oh, good question, Laurel. Can I answer that? I think it just comes with practice, because I do so much of this edge-to-edge work. It feels very natural to me to just ignore where the seams and colors are and just stitch the design. So I guess my answer is practice. Don't know that I have a great answer. Maybe someone else wants to chime in on their experience with that. I'll quickly keep pinning, because then I will naturally move closer to the camera and it will get that much easier. So I'm just putting pins. I mean, it varies with the fabrics, but there is not a ripply edge on this, so that's helpful. So I'm just dropping pins every 3 inches or so. And I'm going to stop and say something before I get to the next question. I'm always balancing things, right? So in this quilt, I'm balancing the fact that I can't pull on this too hard, because it will make my edges stretch out. I want to pull as much as I can to pull this excess toward the edge, right? So it's just that balancing act. And that is so often true. In other projects that I've done, a couple weeks ago, I did a small double wedding ring table topper, and it had tighter centers, and these edges had so much excess in them. So that was a bit different process. So I'm always feeling my way a little bit, and I'm often going for the middle road, not too tight, not too loose. I feel a bit like Goldilocks. Not too hot, not too cold, but just right. Okay, another question. Jill, I also use the red snapper side clamps, although the older version, and when I struggle to get the backing fabric into the clamps, I keep a firm index card close by to help the fabric into the clamp. That's a great idea, Jill. I'll try it. I often do it with a pin. I just run it along that edge, and I find that effective, but sometimes it takes time and is awkward, and so I thought maybe not the best use of camera time while I'm live. But yes, the index card is a great idea, and I will try that. Thank you for that. Sandra, hi, it's very enjoyable to watch you quilt. Great informative talk. Just bought those side clamps. Can't wait to use them. Where is your spool of thread on Lucy? Yes, can you see it? The very lower right-hand corner of your screen. You're just seeing the top edge of it. What you can't really see on that is my fancy-dancy thread net. I've talked about this on tool episodes before. Lucy does not do well with just a spool, unspooling on there. Inevitably, that hank of thread falls down and catches on something and breaks. And that happened to me quite a few times before I realized, hey, I need a thread net. So I took a lonely sock from my laundry room. Surely I'm not the only one that has lonely socks. Anyway, a pretty big sock. And I cut off the heel end and I cut off the toe end. And that central part is my thread net. And eventually the elastic kind of gets floppy and loose, and then I just grab another lonely sock. So here you guys can kind of see, I think, this has pulled a little too tight in here, so I'm getting all this fullness, and it's because this is pulled too hard. So I'm actually going to undo a little bit of pinning and shift this circle a little. And some of that fullness has got to get taken up in the center. There's no point in stretching out that outer edge, because when I take the quilt off the long arm rails, that will pull back in and misshape the thing. So I've got to figure it out while I'm here. So I'm allowing those outer edges to come in just a little bit. I'm getting just a bit smaller circle, which is giving me more excess in the middle, but is making this outer edge lay flatter. So again, my balancing act at play. It's really pulling up here. Probably this outer corner, whoever binds this quilt might even want to trim off a little bit of this to get a smooth edge, because there's actually a bit of a divot right here on the outer edge of that corner that I can't seem to get out of there. This seam is really pulled up. Yeah, and there's knots under there and it's hand stitched, so I can't fix that. I've got to live with it. I'm just always keeping in mind, no matter how imperfect, this quilt is going to be finished and used and loved. So keep the purpose in mind. Okay, a few more comments Dave's telling me. Sue, finally found you. I signed up for the notification but didn't receive any. Is there an easy way to find the current episode on YouTube? Dave, you can answer this privately if you wish. I mean, my YouTube channel will usually have the upcoming live on it. I often talk about it in my newsletters. And I did this week, but I won't say I do every time because there's just me, and every so often I don't get a newsletter out. But on the YouTube channel, you should be able to find them by most recent date. And in terms of actually going live, first and third Friday of every month. Same time, every time. Let's put a few more pins in the middle while we're here. This end is really going to be, going to be a challenge. We signed on for a challenge, didn't we? So I'm going to put a few pins in here, trying to distribute this. And we'll keep our fingers crossed for no pleats, but I just don't know. Okay, more comments? Kelly, do you ever bury your threads? Absolutely, I do. For various reasons. If it's a solid fabric, and I think it might show a lot. If it's a special quilt, you bet. But it is more time consuming, so it's always a consideration. Is that the time I should be spending on this quilt? And in this one in particular, there are so many loose threads and kind of knots showing and things like that, right? That's not a good investment of my time. So I'm not burying the threads on this quilt. Is that it? Or do we have, oh boy. I better keep looking up because I'm nearly done pinning and I'm not done talking. Here we go. Let me grab a sip while I keep talking. How's that? Dorothy, I'm wanting to do a wedding ring. How can I do the piecing? And I want to make one of these. How can I piece it better? I will say I'm not an expert in piecing, Dorothy, but I just strongly recommend, wrong camera, sorry, strongly recommend that you look that up on YouTube. I guarantee you there will be tutorials. And if you look up piecing a double wedding ring, also, I often recommend that you look at a few videos and find a teacher, a person instructing who kind of speaks your language, explains things your way. So explore a bit there. I'm pretty sure you'll find one or several people who explain it well. Much better than I could in a few minutes here for sure, okay? Amanda, I recently bought my red snapper system and clamps. The clamps these days come with a very thin neon yellow ruler, and there's a YouTube video on how to use it to get the fabric into the little slot. You're right, Amanda. Mine came with that ruler too. I personally found it unwieldy because it's long, like the clamp, and I prefer to use something smaller in my hand, so I like the index card idea that I think it was Jill floated. But yes, by all means, that does come with your snappers, and it's a great idea to watch the video that kind of walks you through that process. It's helpful. Joanne, love this wedding ring quilt. Thank you for sharing. You're welcome. I hug my kids. I'm sorry I can't remember your first name. It started with a C. Carla, maybe? Anyway, thanks for sharing your knowledge with us. I just looked up your tutorial on how to baste an entire quilt on the long arm. So well done, clear and concise. Lisa, there we go. Thanks, Lisa, for the compliment. And maybe that's a good topic here while I get quilting. But do we have more comments? And I'll talk about that basting a little bit more as I go further. Okay. Maybe, because quite a few people are commenting, if you actually have a question, maybe put a Q in front of it. That helps Dave when he's, scrolling back through a bunch of them to quickly see them. I'm looking for my ruler. And remind me if I forget to come back to talking about the all-over basting for a minute and why I'm not doing it on this quilt. So I've got my ruler plate on, remember, so that I have a bit of ruler area underneath. It's a little hard for you guys to see because I'm up against the quilt roll, but I'm going to be out of there in just a jiffy. I just want access to the entire circle all in one fell swoop. Can you see what I'm doing now? So I'm just using my ruler It's not the same curve. Well, there isn't a regular curve, a smooth curve. And that doesn't really matter. I'm just using it as something I can bump my presser foot up against. Even a straight ruler would be helpful here. It just helps me to keep control of my presser foot. In fact, just to show you guys, I'll pull out my straight ruler because I often do this on a curve. And just to show you, it doesn't matter if you don't have to have just the right ruler. Just something that's a bit of a barrier for that presser foot to keep it from running amok on you. And it turns out my quilt still isn't far enough forward to do the whole thing. My ruler plate kind of inhibits how far forward I can quilt without bumping the rail. So there we go. I am going to use the curved one because I prefer it since I have it. But I just wanted to show you, a curve is not necessary. You can do this with absolutely any long arm ruler that you have. As a little side note, some people, not sure if they're friends, call me the queen of frugal. When I was, early long arming, I didn't have any rulers and I didn't know if I would like ruler work, so I didn't really want to invest a ton of money into them. Long arm rulers are quite pricey. And so the first heavily detailed ruler work quilt that I worked on, I used an add a quarter ruler. And if you don't know what that is, it's actually a cutting ruler, and it's got like a 1/4 inch lip on the one side so that you can add a 1/4 inch seam allowance easily to a pattern piece. Well, that lip is thick like a long arm ruler, so I quilted my whole first heavily detailed quilt with an add a quarter ruler. That's kind of crazy in retrospect, but it worked, and it enabled me to determine if that was where I wanted to invest my money or not. So I'm not sorry. Mr. Producer is asking me about changing where my hand is, but honestly, guys, I really can't. So bear with me. It keeps shifting, so one view or another, you're going to get to see the whole thing. And again, remember, this stitching does not have to be pretty because it's all going to fall within the binding. I'm making sure to stitch well within a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Sometimes, like that time, I run right off the edge. So it does not have to be a smooth curve or a straight line or anything like that. It just needs to be stitched down so it's held in place. Know where your priorities are. Just get her done. So while I do this, because it is going to take a few more minutes, let's talk about basting. Amanda was saying she had watched my video on basting a whole quilt. What that means to me is when I'm working on a quilt that has maybe multiple colors in it, and I want to be able to forward and rewind my quilt on the long arm frequently without anything shifting out of place, then I will baste the whole quilt. And that basically involves basting the sides, as I do in every quilt, and then every 16 inches or so, I also baste a line from side to side across the quilt, right through the middle, with big jumping stitches. And that just holds everything in place. And I did think about doing that on this quilt because that certainly would have stabilized it. But this comes under the heading of the things that I determined I had to live with. I was not going to be able to get it perfect, and I determined I could get it close enough by eyeballing the lines of the lemons, the piecing. Lemons isn't the word. Melons, that's the word I want. Same letters. I determined I could do that by eyeballing, and so I chose not to spend the time basting it because it does take some time to do that. But know that that's an option. If you're not comfortable just floating the top of the quilt hanging down in front of you and then, planning the straightness of it as you come to it, you can do that all in advance if that's easier for you. And I'm going to shift these pins. It does not work well to have the thick head of the pins under the ruler, and sometimes you just can't get away from it and you have to deal with a wobbly ruler, but it's a lot easier if the heads of the pins go the other way. So I'm just going to shift them because I can. I do stitch over my pins. I'm going fairly slowly, as you can see. Knock on wood, I have never broken a pin doing this. That works for me. I know there are people who would not do that, so you do you. But for me, that works well. I just stitch a little bit slowly over them, and it just keeps things absolutely from shifting, and that's what I'm after. I'm just taking out the pins all the way along this front edge before I roll it back a little bit. So I can base that last little bit of curve, and then we're up and quilting again. And we are on the last row of rings. So while I do this, if anyone is just tuning in, you are watching Susan Smith. This is a live and unscripted episode, meaning I'm live streaming, real time, the quilting of a project. I do these the first and third Friday of every month, and I try to just show the reality of quilting a whole project in my studio. And in this case, we're working on a vintage double wedding ring quilt that has some real challenges with bubbly areas that have to be tamed. So that is part of the process today. So this was a two-part episode, two-part series. Today is episode 2. Yesterday was episode 1. It can be found on YouTube as well. And we're just finishing up basting the last of the curves, and then we'll finish up the quilting. I chose an edge-to-edge or all-over design for this quilt because I had so much excess fabric to deal with. I didn't think it was possible to do specific designs in specific areas and not drive myself crazy and possibly have a poorer result because I wouldn't be able to avoid pleats. So I chose an edge-to-edge or all-over feather. The curvy quality of it and the small individual plumes work together to really help me take up that excess. So Mr. Producer is telling me we have a few more questions. I'll get in a couple more sips and then we'll get on to quilting. Okay, question? Joey, Dave, I hope that your stock drawer has socks that continue to multiply, creating replacements. Well, you know, I've never run out yet, so I don't think that's a problem. Jenny, question, how do you deal with the customers that expect perfection on every quilt no matter how wonky the quilt you received? How often do you get a Karen that expects show quality? Being really truthful, I think I can safely say never. I'm really honest with my clients when they come with their quilt, when they bring it to me, or when it comes in the mail. And if I need to, I back up my honesty with some photographs. This and this and this is what I'm dealing with. And this is what you can expect. And I'll do this for you, but here's what I can't promise. So in this quilt, for example, I did not promise no pleats because I knew it wouldn't happen. Not that Carla and Janet, who gave it to me to quilt, asked for it, but I would not promise that. Jenny, can you do an episode on your most commonly used thread colors so we as newbies know where to start stocking? Great idea, Jenny. Thank you for that. We'll jot that one down today, and yes, I'll try and do that, even if it's like a little extra short one at some point talking about threads. Sure. That's it? Okay. Because I don't think I've mentioned it today, I am using Isocord 100% polyester thread, and it is a 40 weight thread. I particularly love the Isocord brand for a couple of reasons. Number one, it has over 300 colors, which I love. I love having, I think I have 10 or 11 shades of green. I'm just looking at my thread rack over there. I love having that option of just the perfect shade. And I also love the strength of the thread. So it was designed with embroidery machines in mind. So commercial things like think chef's jackets and caps and those sorts of things that have embroidery on them. So it's designed with high speed, commercial usage in mind. So it lends itself very well to long arm quilting because it works pretty reliably on a long arm machine. So those are the reasons I love Isocord. And today, in particular, I'm using an eggshell color. And it is one of my staples for Jenny, who was asking. It's a subtle enough cream that I can use it on white, use it on cream, even use it on all the pale pastels, the pale yellow, the pale pink if I want to. It kind of takes on that color. Oh, someone's reminding me about the ruler base. Bless your heart. It's tricky. I'm telling you, it's tricky to both talk and quilt at the same time and remember all the things. So yes, I did in fact forget the ruler. So as you saw, I just did a couple lock stitches, moved Lucy. I'm having a hard time getting to where I can reach that ruler base. There we go. Thank you for that reminder. I do appreciate it, and it is worth pausing to get it off because it makes all the difference in the world in being able to manipulate my fabric. So I'll start back at the same place. Once again, I'll overlap just a wee little bit of stitching, 4 or 5 lock stitches in there, and I'll come back and trim the thread tails in a moment. And this is why we call it live and unscripted, people. Yes, that makes all the difference to have that freedom to move the fabric around. Can you see my pins as I'm approaching them below? Those were my markers. Make sure you get all the fabric included before you reach this pin. This particular all-over feather is one of my very favorite things to quilt. And if it's something that you have not done and would like to do, I do have a free class on this process, and it is very step by step. It starts with the individual shape of the individual plumes and talks you through lots of details and demos the quilting of how I turn corners and how I fill awkward areas and all that stuff. So easiest way to grab that class right now is to just go to my website and you'll get a little pop-up registration form. It does require registration because you need to get like login access to the class, but it is entirely free. And you can watch it as many times as you want. So if this is a design that you love, that's the easiest way to get your hands on it. And it definitely is a design that is helpful for quilting a challenging quilt like this, for taking up excess. All these small curves are your best friend. Let's pause for just a second and cut our thread tails while we're here. And move a couple of our marker pins. You know, when I am getting into these problem areas that I'm really manipulating, not every single feather ends up looking perfect. Again, I'm accepting of that fact. I may not get all the things perfect. But there are no pleats there, so I'm happy with that. Can you see how this process of just stretching the fabric a little over Lucy's nose is what aids me to pull that fullness in? It's seriously, it's just like magic. I'm not joking when I say we're pulling a quilted rabbit out of the hat. We pretty much are. Here again, that little double feather, you can see it there nicely on the solid. Just to tuck that seam allowance down nice and flat and smooth. There again, some real fullness over Lucy's little nose here. So helpful. Just to stretch that into place. And basically all we're doing is amplifying the distribution of that fabric, right? That's my theme with this whole quilt. Distribute, distribute, distribute. Here too. And I'll just slow down if need be. Give that fabric time. Almost under every stitch, a little bit of fullness is pulling up. And the pressure I'm putting on with my left hand is what kind of pulls that fabric more quickly under the needle than it would go if I was just driving it out in front of me, out in front of the hopper foot. Can you see right here? This is just like a little button. There's so much fullness in there, but in fact, there are no pleats. And so when this quilt is being used, when it's been handled a bit, when it's been washed a bit, that will look perfectly natural and normal in there. It will not be obvious that we actually had problems quilting this project. Truly, it is like magic. I am stitching this in regulated mode, which means the movement of the needle speeds up and slows down with how rapidly I'm moving the machine. I will often recommend edge-to-edge designs done in a constant mode, where the needle's moving at a constant speed. I think that can be more rhythmic, certainly more relaxing to quilt. However, in the case of this project, where I need to speed up and slow down so much just to either maintain control or to have a moment to look ahead and gauge where I'm going, I think it's wisdom to use regulated mode if you have it. And if you don't have it, then I just recommend slowing down your speed considerably to what you would usually be quilting. Now can you see here we're coming up on a big gnarly bit of seam allowances. Again, I'm slowing way down to give myself time to manage it. I'm going to do a secondary loop in there, and presto. Nailed it. Cool. And off we go. You may not be able to see on camera, but my thumb way up here in front is actually putting tension on. Can you see how this changes when I put that tension on there? That's the difference that manipulating over the nose makes. It's pulling the fabric under the needle more quickly, just coaxing it in there. And that's exactly the result we want to achieve. You can see the quite stained area that I just quilted over. Now that again was one of the contributing reasons to why we chose an economical, really, edge-to-edge design over doing custom quilting. Double wedding rings can look really spectacular with custom quilting. The one that you've seen behind me this morning is an example of that. I entered that show, or that quilt, sorry. Her name is Audrey, by the way. I entered that quilt in a number of shows, and she won a number of ribbons. But the decision has to be made, you know, what is the purpose of this quilt, and what is an appropriate time investment, and maybe even what is the lifetime of this quilt. So the one I'm working on today, you know, it does have a lot more challenges. It's not as precisely pieced. And so that was kind of our consensus, is that this one is best suited toward the edge-to-edge design in terms of time and just in terms of dealing with the challenges that it presents. Audrey behind me was, you know, more accurately pieced, and so it lent itself to doing that fancy ruler work and detailed designs in some of the small areas. This one is just not that quilt, so we're going to be realistic about that and make a lovely finished quilt, and we're still extending its life by a lot. We're giving it a life. It hasn't really had one before, let's be honest. So, but it's not ever going to be a show quilt. Now what it might be, and I might have to borrow it back from Carla, it is an excellent teaching tool, right, of what can be done and of the reasons for some of these decisions that we made regarding this quilt. So if there ever comes a day when I'm traveling about the country talking about quilts again, it would be an excellent teaching tool for that reason, because it illustrates a lot of these points that I'm making. I'm just traveling along in my little basting line. All right, let us forward just a little. I'm going to take my clamps off the right and left. Do we have some comments coming in that we want to pause for? Mr. Producer, sir? Okay, let me just fast forward a few inches and then I will stand and chat for a minute, or at least read them for a minute. All right. Barbara, really seeing a change in your speed of stitching compared to some of the other live and unscripted on less fussy quilts. That is true. And that's kind of why I was recommending the regulated stitching, because it is a different pace and I'm definitely going slower overall. Right. Jill, I also took the all over feather class. Highly recommend it. Thanks, Jill. Appreciate that. Mr. Producer says he has put the link in the comments, so making it super easy for you guys. Sue, I quilt on a sit-down long arm and was wondering if stitching a basting stitch around the perimeter would keep the quilt square. I'm not an expert on that, Sue. When I quilted on a domestic machine, which is how I started, I used spray basting to kind of keep the whole thing together, and then a certain amount of pins. I don't know that quilting the perimeter edge will keep it square. It will act a bit like the pins that I'm placing here and there, acting like this one. It's almost your barrier. But because you're not putting any tension on that, I don't know how that will really help you toward achieving final squareness. So that might be a question for a person who quilts on a sit down more than I do. That's it for questions. Okay, folks, we are seeing the end. And for a minute here, I am going to be quilting at arm's length. You know what? I can feel already. I forgot to put my clamps on. Let's do that quick. Just that little bit of pull on the edges helps. Helps a lot. Okay. Not too many minutes and we'll have this nailed down. I'm so used to quilting square quilts and to working with, 90-degree corners and edges to my quilting. I have to really think about it to realize that I'm working with a rounded edge here and how to fill that in and fill it in well. I'm honestly really pleased with how this is turning out. I truly didn't know when I loaded it up yesterday. I thought, I'm really putting myself out there because I don't know how this is going to turn out or how well it's going to come together. But I need to have faith. It's coming together beautifully. It's going to be a gorgeous quilt. Quilts photograph best in the mornings in my studio, so I'll wait for some decent morning light tomorrow or the next day, but I will be sure to capture lots of photographs of this quilt and let you see how it looks, overall, the overall impression. Because of course that's the important thing. If you look terribly closely, you will inevitably find a few small pleats, quite a few less than perfect feathers. But what really matters is what does the quilt look like as a whole. And I have to advance Lucy just a hair. I'm bumping up against that front edge. All right. So if you have enjoyed this, I really invite you to like and subscribe to my channel. Share this with your quilting buddies who you think might find it of interest as well. And first and third Friday of the month are the regular live and unscripteds. I try to always do a whole project, but they really vary in terms of topic or challenge. All right, here's a nice little thing to point out. See the little pleat I just created? What's happening here is there is quite a pleat, like quite a large pleat in this melon shape. And I was purposely not trying to flatten out that pleat because where would I go with all that excess anyways? But I inadvertently flipped it when I was stitching it. So remember the principle, when you're pulling in fullness, what catches the eye is what's sticking up. Likewise, that's true with a pleat like this. That flip will kind of catch the light and therefore catch your eye. So I'm trying to undo a few stitches and I'm having a terrible time. I'm sure you can see that. I'm trying to just undo that little bit. Oh my goodness, I'm having a terrible time. And partly this is because these older fabrics have such a loose weave that my quilting thread really sinks into it and it is quite difficult to grasp with the seam ripper and pull it out. So I'm quite okay with that pleat being there. I'm just not okay with it flip-flopping from side to side. Actually, what I'm going to do is end my thread right under it. It's not undoing easily, so therefore I know that thread is fairly secure there, and that's not a bad thing. There's still a small piece. I'm going to try and get out. There, we got it. Okay. So now, get that little pleat right under the hopper foot. Move the hopper foot off of it. Get it under the hopper foot again. And now as I do further feathers over here, I'm going to pay attention to that to make sure I keep that laying down, pointing in the right direction. Like right here. And I'm going to actually have to pause and take a tool, in this case my seam ripper, a pin might have been better, get it under my hopper foot so that it doesn't flip up, clip my tails. Okay, we're ready. And that will likely be an example of a feather that is not perfect. However, it will catch your eye much less than a pleat that's flipped up. Here's that same pleat again. I'm just carefully holding it down, manipulating it into place. We got it. Going slow again, really stretching out that fabric over the nose of Lucy underneath, and that's enabling all that excess to just be sucked right in. As I approach the edges, because I kept that basting stitch well within a 1/4 inch, I'm trying to keep my quilting well inside the basting stitch. Does that make sense? So that the person who does the binding has a little room to sew on the binding without cutting off the tips of my feathers. So I'm keeping them ish 3/8 of an inch or so inside the edge of the quilt. That's personal preference, I suppose. It's not the end of the world if the tip of a feather gets cut off, but I feel like it looks nicer if that does not happen. And we just ran out of bobbin thread. Remember my philosophy? I just let it run out and then I back up a little bit and do my splice. And when I can, I back up to a corner because the machine always does a couple of, especially when you're in regulated mode, always does a couple of stitches in quick succession there, so it's kind of a natural lock. And then I overlap a little bit and starting with my new stitching. I like to load my own bobbins because I prefer to have same thread top and bottom, or at least very, very similar. That just works well for me. If you love experimenting with threads, you go for it. But for me, I like having the same top and bottom, so I choose to wind my own bobbins. I do have a freestanding winder, and in a moment I'll go off camera to grab my bobbin, and you can see just how long it takes me to grab a new one and pop the next one onto the loader and set it going. And I drop my seam ripper right where my splice is, so that in case it's a busy print, I'm not left hunting for where I ended when I came back. So yeah, it just takes a few seconds to set up a new bobbin and get it going. And someone asked yesterday, or recently anyways, if I keep 2 spools of thread for that reason, and the answer is yes. And I do that for most of my common threads. You certainly don't have to. You can estimate how many bobbins you'll have and preload them before a quilt. That works too if you don't want to keep double spools. And where's my tail? There it is. Mr. Producer's laughing at me. Where's my tail? So again, just a few lock stitches in place. 4, 5, 6, somewhere in there. And we're up and away. And I'll just take a second and trim those thread tails. You can see all those ripples, they're just being eased right in there. Here again, you'll see I'm leaving just a little space outside my feathers. That was kind of a weird looking one, wasn't it? Just a little space outside of them so that the binding does not cut off the tips of the feathers. Well, this is the last pass, and I'm pretty sure that will be the last bobbin change. So if you have any questions or comments, now's a good time to be typing them in. And remember, I will post photos of the whole thing so you get the big picture view of what this all looks like. The binding will not be done because I'm not doing that part of it. But you'll at least get to see the effect of the quilting as a whole. For those of you who have talked about the fact that you want to do your own double wedding ring, I will make one recommendation for the binding, and that is that you do a bias binding. just because of the curves. Some quilters love doing bias bindings all the time. Many use a straight of grain binding most of the time, but I really recommend the bias for these curves. It has a lot more give to it because you'll be manipulating that binding much like I'm manipulating the fabric and easing it in here and there. The bias will make binding around those curves ever so much easier. And again, there are lots of tutorials on YouTube for that process, so hunt those out. There's even a crease pressed into the fabric that we're going to get smooth. Look at us go. That time I did a little better, leaving myself enough room for full-size feathers near that outer perimeter, and that made it easier to leave the 3/8 inch edge. Still using those double feathers to stitch down the seam allowances that tend to want to pop up. Works beautifully. Okay, we're heading into the last ring, and of course we've left a lovely challenge for last. This is one of the puffiest rings in the whole quilt. Sometimes, a little tip for you that sometimes works, is when you're looking at a whole pass from left to right of the quilt and you can see that one side is the puffy est. In this case it was the left, which I'm coming to now. I purposely stitched the right hand side first so that it would take up, almost pull up, perhaps, I was hoping, for some of that excess. And I think it actually did. This is looking not too bad approaching it. So even on your everyday quilts that are not this extreme for excesses, that can just be helpful. If one side is a little fuller, do the other side first and it'll just pull up some of that excess. In the same way that we put the magnetic bars on to prevent that happening on the front edge of the quilt, you can use that propensity of quilts, to use a big word, to pull up as you're quilting. You can use that in your favor. I actually did a quilt, a week or 10 days or so ago, and I posted pictures in Facebook group that I have with my students. Because this quilt did have a bubbly center and tight borders, I used that in my favor. I did not use the magnetic bars at all as I was quilting the entire project because I wanted that central area to pull up. So every time I advanced the quilt, I kind of zhuzhed the fabric up into where I thought it should be and that left excess throughout the pass, and I kind of spread it around with my fingers and arranged it and then quilted it down, and I left those bars off the front so that it would, on purpose, pull that fabric up in as I was quilting, and it worked a treat. The end is in sight, and this has been a marathon of quilting. I really hope that it's been helpful for you just to see this kind of bird's eye view of the whole process and the decisions I've made. You know, some I would do differently if I were to do it again. I think I might purposely choose a fluffier batting. I think that would have gone a long way toward helping. Some decisions I would do exactly the same. I would definitely do an edge to edge again. I think that was right, and I think these feathers were right. They suit the style. They take up all my, you know, the most possible amount of excess. So I hope it's been helpful for you to see my thought processes as I go through it, and might help you when you come to decision making for your quilts. Got a tight little corner here to fill in, but we'll get it. There's a little pleat. We're stitching it down. Let's see. We're going to have to do some creative stitching here. Let's go down first and then up. I know you guys probably can't see the big picture that I'm seeing, but I've got a long, thin area here to fill up. So I'm just choosing to fill in one end of it first, and then I'm going to turn a tight corner with some small feathers and fill in the other end. And a few lock stitches in that binding area, and we are finished, folks. I'm so tickled. I think the magic has been accomplished. I think we've got our quilted rabbit pulled out of our hat. Yay! No, I am pleased with that. Overall, that lays nice and flat. Beautiful. Beautiful. I need a celebratory sip of coffee. Okay, any comments or questions about this process? My nose is red from my glasses. And I better stay back with my coffee. Comments, Dave, Mr. Producer? Here they come. Karen. Susan, how do you feel when you take the last stitch on a project? Thrilled it's finished? Sad? Mostly thrilled it's finished. I have a short attention span. I'm always ready for the next project. So yeah, it's very rewarding for sure. I mean, this quilt particularly, really rewarding to see it come to fruition. Hang on, Mr. Producer is messing with the camera here. Julianne, are you going to bind it? I am not. I am not. It's a lady and her daughter-in-law who brought it to me. I'm not sure. I think it belongs to the daughter-in-law, Carla, who's here watching today or was earlier. And their mom, grandma, is binding it. She loves binding quilts. So yeah, I'm not the binder. Joey, my quilts were in competition in the 90s. I pinned and made sure they were square. Need to have it perfectly square in the big competition, and domestic quilter cannot compete with long arm quilters. But you know, Joey, because of course more people feel that way, it's in more and more quilt shows you're seeing divisions and categories for those different skill sets, because they are different skill sets for sure. Yeah, and I'm happy to see that. Sue, after you're done quilting, do you block all the quilts you work on? I don't. I block my own, and I do what I call simple blocking, which means I don't get out my laser square and all that sort of stuff. I do it usually on my carpeted floor with a tape measure and make it square. But I don't block my client quilts. I often recommend it to them, but I don't do it myself. Donna, what is the thread and weight you're using? I have Isacord 100% poly thread, and it is a 40 weight. Laurel, is there an average number of bobbins you use on E2E designs for a queen size quilt? I can give you a range. You know, it does depend obviously on the density of quilting. I tend not to do super loose quilting. So for a queen size quilt, I'm going to say 4 is the least and could go as high as 7. Something like that. Yeah. This one I used 4 and I had a partial one that I started with. So about 4.5 on this quilt. It's not a huge quilt either. It's about 70 by 85. Barbara, doesn't your coffee get cold? Thanks for thinking of me. And yes, it does get cold, but it still is helpful for wetting my whistle. Barbara, really helpful. Both things, the things you discuss and being able to watch you stitch. Thank you. You're welcome. I appreciate hearing that. And honestly, that's why I do it. I just think it's got to be helpful to be able to see how someone does it from beginning to end with all the knots and tangles in it. Diana, love watching you work. Great. Thank you. Deborah, this was fantastic. Thanks for sharing. Great. Thanks, ladies, for sharing that. It really makes it worthwhile for sure. Donna, do you use the same thread in the bobbin? Yes, I do. I'm trying to think of an occasion when I've used different. So I occasionally will use a somewhat different color for various reasons, but I pretty much always use my isocord thread. I'm a creature of habit. I use my isocord thread for everything. I don't have a wide range of threads on my thread wall. That's just my preference. And yeah. So yeah, that about does it. Okay, so quick recap. We've been working on a double wedding ring. It is vintage, 40s, maybe 30s. Its great big challenge was these areas of bubbly excess fabric, small areas that were everywhere. So not just a bubbly perimeter or a bubbly center, but all this excess that needed containing. So that was the #1 challenge in this quilt. So did an edge to edge or all over feather design because those curves and those small elements just pulled that all in really nicely. So I will be sure to post photographs that show you kind of the whole quilt laying out and in folds a little bit so you get the impression of what that all looks like when it's finished. So yes, I am here doing live and unscripted quilting the 1st and 3rd Friday of every month, 9 a.m. Pacific time. Different challenges each time, different quilts, different projects. So just showing you getting real in my studio. So I appreciate you joining in today. It has been a pleasure quilting with you. So until next time, happy quilting.